My name is Emily James. I'm 28 years old, and I was born in Norfolk, Virginia, a place where the air smells like salt, jet fuel, and unspoken expectations. The neighborhood I grew up in didn't ask kids what they wanted to be when they grew up. It told them, you could be military, or disgrace. My family didn't just believe in service, it breathed it. My grandfather fought in Korea, my uncle in Vietnam, and my father, well, my father was a legend in the Marine Corps. People used to salute him even out of uniform. But if you ask him about me, he'd probably change the subject. I don't remember when I first knew I wanted to serve. Maybe it was watching the ships roll in from the coast, or maybe it was just the silence in our home every time I asked about anything else. I do remember clearly being 8 years old, sitting across from my father at the long oak dinner table. I had drawn a picture. Me, in uniform, standing next to him. I pushed it across the table like it was proof I could belong. He looked at it, paused, and said nothing. Just went back to his food. That was the first time I understood what being invisible felt like. I didn't grow up with praise. My older brother got that. He had shoulders like our dad's, and a chin that squared when he was angry. When he enlisted, my father brought out a bottle of scotch he'd been saving for 10 years. When I announced I'd applied to the Naval Academy, my father left the room. He didn't speak to me for the rest of the week. No arguments, no yelling, just absence, like someone took a carving knife and cut me out of the family photo. I made it into the academy anyway. No help, no letter of recommendation, no visit on move-in day. At first, I thought the silence would break, that when he saw I wasn't quitting, when I earned my place, he'd say something, anything. But time passed. I graduated in the top 10% of my class. I trained harder than anyone. I pushed myself past exhaustion just so no one could say I didn't deserve to be there. The calls still never came. Not on my commissioning, not after my first deployment. Not when I was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for saving lives after an engine fire tore through a transport chopper off Okinawa. Instead, I got a single message. Text only, no punctuation. Hope you're proud of yourself. I used to read that message over and over, wondering what he meant. Was it sarcasm? Disgust? Some warped version of approval? I never figured it out. There were times I almost gave in, thought maybe I was chasing the wrong dream, that I'd never really belong. But the silence had taught me something too. How to live without permission. I learned to carry my own weight, then someone else's. I became the kind of officer I had once imagined in that childhood drawing, only stronger. Not because of him, but in spite of him. Still, sometimes I would see other women in the service with their fathers, a photo in a frame, a message on their birthday, a flag folded by familiar hands. I didn't envy the love, I envied the recognition. The simple yes, I see you. I didn't have that. I had silence. And silence, when it comes from someone who should have loved you, is not empty. It's loud. But I didn't let it break me. I let it sharpen me. And as I climbed, year after year, command after command, there was one thought that always followed me like a shadow in formation. If I ever reached the top, would he even look? I didn't know the answer, but I was going to find out. The first time someone called me ma'am and meant it without hesitation, no irony, no edge, was in the middle of a storm. We were deployed off the coast of the Philippines after a typhoon had torn through the region, collapsing hospitals and cutting off entire towns. I was a lieutenant commander then, leading a rescue and recovery team that ran mostly on adrenaline and unspoken loyalty. That night, visibility was down to nothing. Winds screaming like they had something personal to say. We'd received word of a collapsed clinic that still had survivors inside, but the hill above it was about to give. Mudslide imminent. Every second mattered. One of my team, a 19-year-old medic from Kansas named Del Toro, froze. Just stood there, eyes wide, staring at the wreckage like it was alive. I didn't yell, didn't bark orders like I'd seen other officers do. I just stepped next to him, put my hand on his shoulder and said, "Follow me." He did. We got everyone out. 10 people. 1 infant. 3 of my team came out bleeding. I came out last. Back on the ship, as we stitched each other up and shook off the weight of it all, Del Toro looked at me, really looked, and said, "You don't lead like other officers. You don't walk ahead of us. You walk with us." I didn't know how to answer. I wasn't used to being seen that way. I wasn't sure I deserved it. But the others nodded, and from that night on, something changed. I wasn't just a name on a command chain. I was theirs. Over time, I built something no one had taught me how to build, a family made not by blood, but by fire. People who had seen me crawl through rubble, dig with bare hands, sleep in soaked boots. People who knew the way my hands shook after every mission I said I was fine through. They saw me, and they stayed. One of them, a communications engineer named Carabelle, once said, "If I had to be stranded in hell with someone, I'd choose you. You don't leave people behind." She didn't say it like a compliment. She said it like a fact. It was around this time I met Lucas. We collided during a joint mission with a civilian humanitarian engineering group. He wasn't like anyone I'd known. Too quiet, too observant. He asked questions like they meant something, and he didn't flinch when I answered honestly. We were repairing a freshwater system that had collapsed after a skirmish in Eastern Africa. Tense region. No guarantees. Lucas carried his gear like he'd done it for a decade, but he wasn't military. He didn't follow chain of command. He didn't even seem particularly interested in it. But one night, after I'd spent 16 hours organizing water drops and coordinating with the embassy, I sat down next to him, exhausted and shaking. He handed me a protein bar and said, "You carry everything like you're afraid it'll fall if you don't." I looked at him. "Maybe it will." He just nodded. "Then I'll hold it with you." That night, I didn't sleep alone. You'd think my father might have asked about him, maybe reached out. But even when the news ran the story, naval commander leads civilians out of hostile region, there was nothing. Not a word. But I was different now. I stopped expecting calls that wouldn't come. I stopped leaving space in my life for someone who chose silence. I kept rising. By the time I was 34, I'd been promoted to Rear Admiral, youngest in my region's history. I'd designed new trauma response protocols now used across multiple divisions. I'd overseen missions that prevented disasters no one would ever hear about. And when Lucas asked me to marry him, I said yes, not because it was safe, but because he never once asked me to be anything less than what I was. We planned the wedding ourselves. No decorators, no grand church. Just a decommissioned naval museum off the coast of Maryland, filled with the people who'd held the line beside me for years. I didn't pick out a dress. Instead, I had my white formal uniform pressed, the one with 4 silver stars. I wasn't going to wear something that made me look like someone else. Not for anyone. Not even for love. The morning of the ceremony, I received a message. It was from my father. 3 words. No greeting, no punctuation. "You in uniform?" Then, pathetic. I read it once, deleted it, turned off my phone, and something inside me settled. Not like a collapse, but like a lock finally clicking into place. There was no space left in me for that kind of smallness. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that I was walking down the aisle that day flanked by people who'd taken bullets for me. People I'd pulled from fire and blood and fear. People who didn't need a shared last name to call me their own. What he couldn't understand was that I was never walking alone. The building we chose wasn't a chapel. It used to be a World War II naval museum, stone and steel, faded flags behind glass, stories in every corner that nobody talked about anymore. It smelled like old oil, fresh varnish, and memory. There were no white bows, no rose petals, no string quartet. Just echoing footsteps, the quiet hum of air conditioning, and rows of chairs filled by men and women in uniform. And a few not in uniform, who'd bled anyway. I stood in the back hallway with Kara, my longtime second-in-command. She helped adjust the metal bar on my chest like she was preparing me for deployment, not a wedding. "You sure about the uniform?" she asked. I nodded. "This is who I am." Kara smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "He's not here, you know." I checked the parking lot. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He was never coming. I knew that. The only thing I hadn't known was whether it would still hurt. It didn't. The music began. Not a traditional march, but a soft instrumental version of America the Beautiful. It was Lucas's idea. "Because you are the beautiful part," he'd told me with that crooked, half-shy smile of his. I stepped into the long hall, heels clicking on the polished floor, the scent of my pressed white uniform mixing with something metallic and old, like memory. At my back, 200 people rose to their feet. Not out of habit, not because of ceremony, but because they chose to. And then, someone, I'll never know who, shouted from the back, "Admiral on deck!" It was too loud, too raw, too unscripted. But within seconds, the entire hall responded, not in silence, but in thunder. Boots stamped, palms hit foreheads, salutes filled the air. No one told them to. It wasn't protocol, but it was truth. I kept walking, throat tight. The kind of tight you get when you've held your breath for half your life and are just now realizing you can let it go. Lucas stood at the front. No tie, no formal jacket. Just a simple navy blue shirt and his signature weathered boots. He looked at me like I was the storm and the stillness after. When I reached him, he didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't try to fix anything. He just took my hands, smiled, and whispered, "There you are." The ceremony was short. We didn't exchange vows about forever. We talked about choice, how every day we'd choose to return to each other, no matter how heavy the world became. I said I would love him as I am, not in spite of the steel, but with it. And he promised to never ask me to be softer than I am, only truer. We kissed. People cheered. Kara cried and then swore at herself for it. Later, after the music had faded and plates clinked and stories were told, I stepped outside for a breath of air. The museum overlooked the water where ships once docked. The sun had dipped low, painting everything in gold and copper. That's when I saw the car. It was parked far off, near the edge of the gravel lot, half shadowed by trees, a dark sedan. Government issue model. Windows tinted, and a figure, tall, rigid, unmoving, stood outside the driver's side. Arms crossed. Watching. Not close enough to see the tears or the smiles or the way my team carried my medals around like talismans. Just watching. He never approached. Never opened the door. Never crossed the distance. But I knew who it was. I didn't tell anyone. Not that night. I didn't want him to ruin it, even by accident. And the truth was, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel much of anything except, still, like a storm had passed, and I was standing in the quiet afterward, not needing to rebuild. Let him stand in the distance. Let him keep his silence. I wasn't hollow anymore. I wasn't waiting for a salute that never came. Inside, someone called my name, laughter, music rising again. I turned back toward the life I had built, step by step, mission by mission, A life I had carved out of rejection and doubt and impossible expectation. A life filled with people who had every reason to leave, but stayed. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't find out until days later, was that something in my father shifted that night. Something small, something slow, and it started not with love, but with envy. The letter came 5 days after the wedding. It was postmarked locally. No return address, no stamps. Just placed, deliberately, into our mailbox like someone had driven up in the dark and slipped it in, hoping no one would notice. I recognized the handwriting before I opened it. Block letters. All caps. Neat. Restrained. Like everything else he did. I didn't read it right away. I made coffee first. Sat by the window. Lucas was still asleep, tangled in the sheets like he trusted the world. He never asked about my father, not directly. He knew there were places I hadn't let air touch yet. Places still healing. I opened the envelope with a butter knife. Slowly, as if it might bite. It began plainly. I was there. I couldn't go in. There were no apologies, no dramatic gestures, just admissions. Short, stiff. The kind of language that comes from someone who's only now learning how to speak without a uniform. He wrote about how he used to think strength had a face, square jaw, straight spine. Orders followed, no questions asked. That was what he was raised to believe. That was what he had passed down. Not love, not safety, but standards. And that when I joined the Navy, when I climbed higher than he ever had, part of him didn't know how to see me anymore. I had become something that challenged everything he believed about identity, gender, command, and most painfully, about himself. You didn't fail me, I failed you, because I let silence be my answer when you needed a father, not a sergeant. He said he'd watched through the glass as 200 people stood for me. He didn't know how to describe what he felt except that it was like watching someone return from a war I didn't even know was being fought. The last line wasn't a request. Not exactly. If you want to talk, just talk. I'll be where your mother is. Saturday noon. No uniform. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I just read it again. And then once more, until the words stopped sounding like his and started sounding like mine, the kind I used to wish for, late at night, in the cold silence between deployments. That Saturday, I put on my white dress uniform. Not because I needed to prove anything, but because it was who I was. Every ribbon, every crease, every earned star, they weren't ornaments. They were truths. And I had stopped shrinking for people a long time ago. I arrived early. The cemetery was quiet. Birds overhead, a light breeze. The kind of day that made you believe in grace even if you didn't believe in anything else. He was already there, standing by the headstone with his hands in his pockets. Civilian clothes, a soft flannel shirt I'd never seen him wear. He looked older, somehow. Smaller. Not physically, just like the armor had cracked, and there was finally a person inside. We didn't speak at first. I stood a few feet away, staring at the name carved in granite. My mother. The only one who'd ever whispered when I was little, "Don't let him tell you who to be." Then he turned, looked at me like he was afraid I might vanish, or worse, that I might stay. And then, slowly, almost mechanically, he raised his hand. A salute. Not crisp, not regulation, not even properly timed. But it was real. It shook a little. It hesitated. But it came from a place I had stopped believing existed in him. I held my ground for a long second. Then I raised my hand and returned it. Not because everything was forgiven. Not because he'd earned it. But because I had. Because I was no longer the girl waiting at the dinner table with a drawing of who she hoped to become. I had become her. We talked. About nothing at first. Weather, the cemetery upkeep, how he still drove the same damn sedan. But eventually, the words found their way to places we'd never dared go. We didn't solve everything. We didn't need to. Some silences stay, some ghosts linger. But that day, by my mother's grave, I heard something in his voice I'd never heard before. Humility. He no longer saw me as a threat to his legacy. He saw me as the best part of it. I left him there, staring down at the stone. I didn't look back. Not out of cruelty, but because that chapter, that ache, had finally ended. Not with thunder, not with applause, but with something stronger. Truth. I returned to my life, to Lucas, to the fleet, to the cadets I mentored, the broken systems I was still working to rebuild from the inside out. I wore my uniform like skin. Not a mask, not a shell. A home. One afternoon, a young female recruit stopped me after a lecture. She looked barely 18, all nerves and fire. She said, "Ma'am, I didn't think I could do this until I saw you." I nodded. Didn't need to say anything more, because I knew what she meant. And I remembered. All those years ago, the silence that shaped me, the walls that told me I couldn't, the voice that didn't rise for me. Now others were rising. Because of the fire I carried. Because of the legacy I chose to build. Not from inheritance, but from conviction. And because, when blood didn't salute, 200 others did. And that was more than enough. It always had been. Life doesn't always hand you the version of family you hope for. Sometimes the people meant to protect you are the ones who stay silent the loudest, and sometimes you fight battles long before you ever step onto a battlefield. But I've learned something. Strength isn't about shouting, it's about showing up, over and over, even when no one claps, even when no one sees. And respect? It's not given because of a name or blood. It's earned in the moments when you refuse to give up, even when you're the only one still standing. So if you're watching this and you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, forgotten, just know this. You can still become someone unforgettable. You can still lead, still rise, and you can do it without becoming what hurt you. Stay strong, stay human, and never let anyone silence who you are. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment below. We share powerful stories like this about real people who've been through hell, betrayal, and heartbreak, but came out the other side not just alive, but whole. You're not alone. See you in the next story.